This is the brand new Scott Genius, and it's one of the latest bikes to follow Scott's brand new pursuit of integration. It goes the same way as the Spark and gets that fancy integrated shock, but it brings it to an all-mountain or trail platform. Here we've got it in the range-topping 900 Ultimate build, and holy hats, this costs £12,000. I've ridden this bike for about 3 months, maybe a little bit more, and this is my full review. So let's get some of the housekeeping out of the way, and when I mean housekeeping, I'm talking about the really cool tech built into this bike. And let's address the elephant in the room. So it's the integrated shock, and it's not there for looks alone, because it has meant that the designers has been able to lower the shock in the frame, which should boost stability at speed and lower the center of gravity. But obviously it's encased in carbon, so this improves stiffness massively. This is as the rear wheel goes through its travel, but it's also lateral stiffness that's improved. So the integrated shock raises one big question, and that is, how do you get to the shock? How do you adjust it, and how do you maintain it? So underneath the down tube there is a really easy door. It's got a button, you pull it out, and there is your shock. But what Scott has done is, as usual, collaborated very closely with Fox to create a special nude 5T shock. So this has allowed Fox to make a whole new shock with all the settings right at the top or the bottom of the shock. So there's a Schrader valve well within easy reach, and there is a special rebound dial that's basically a lever and you can just twist it around with one finger. But what really must be noted is that this area isn't a complete seal. So after my 3 months of riding, there's a good dusting of dirt around the shock. But as it stands, it's in much better condition than an exposed shock, because an exposed shock will get far muddier on a wet day than this one will. So on this particular model of the Genius, it's not just the integrated shock that boosts overall stiffness, as this uses Scott's highest end HMX carbon. It's 3 times more expensive than HMF carbon, but it's 20% stiffer for the same weight. So this should result in a hell of a stiff bike. Oh, and as we're on the subject of the integrated shock and doing its adjustments, sag is really easy to set up because Scott has been very clever and has integrated a sag meter in the top left pivot. This is done by friction, just like a normal O-ring. It's not as easy to see as an O-ring, but it's super helpful. It's got all the percentage markings on it, so there's no maths involved like you might find with unmarked shocks. There's even more tech packed into this bike, and it still relates to that shock. So on this bike, it utilises Scott's famed twin lock mechanism, and that cycles through 3 different modes of lockout. But it's rather different on this one. So the shock is built with 2 positive air chambers. So when it's left completely open, it's designed for all-out downhill performance. If you click it in once, this closes off one of the air chambers, which reduces travel, but mainly it lifts the bottom bracket up a little bit and it steepens the seat sheave angle. So you've got an all-round better platform for climbing. Then if you close it off all the way, this closes off most of the shock, but there is still a little bit of squish left behind, which is awesome when you're pedaling super hard up those climbs. It just takes a little bit of the sting of harsher hits away. So on this particular model of the Genius, the fork gets a very similar treatment, as it works with twin lock, but it doesn't get all of the tech that the shock does. Instead, it's just a simple open, middle and close mode. As this bike is built with this very fancy HMX carbon frame, and it's absolutely littered with carbon parts. I mean, if it can be carbon, it is, maybe save for the brakes. This bike weighs 13.8 kilos, and for a 150mm trail bike, that is incredibly light. Okay, so let's move on to the spec, and we've already gone over that shock. So that is the Fox Nude 5T factory, so it gets that nice Kashima coating. 150mm suspension at the rear. At the front you get 160mm suspension, which is the 10mm bump up from last year, and that's provided by the Fox 36 Fit 4. If we move on to the drivetrain, this is the mega fancy SRAM XX1 Axis 12-speed Eagle drivetrain. It's wireless, 12 speeds, and it's got that really slick, oil slick finish. Shifting's really nice. You know, it's top-end SRAM. It's really tough to complain. But then that drivetrain is then matched with Shimano brakes, which makes a bit of a change. These are the Shimano STRs, and we get 4-pot calipers with a 203mm rotor at the front and a 108mm rotor at the rear. Then I think everything else, apart from the tyres, we'll talk about the tyres a little bit later, it all comes from Scott's in-house components brand Syncross. So those are the new Syncross Revelstoke 1.0 S wheels. The Tofino saddle, that comes from Syncross. The Drop post come from Syncross. I think this is 150mm drop. I might be wrong. I'll see if I can fix that somewhere. And then this handlebar. So this is a one-piece handlebar that Scott's recently become very famous for. This is the Hickson, and for this bike, Scott has actually slimmed it down a little bit in order to make it a little bit more compliant. Scott is pretty quiet about the actual specification of this, like the stem or the effective stem length, but this is a 780mm wide bar. And if this kind of look isn't for you, Syncross does offer a special stem which keeps this integrated kind of headset look, but it allows you to fit your own bars. So if that's where you want to go, it's easily done. The tyres are quite an interesting subject on this bike because as standard it comes with a pair of max Receptives with EXO casings. And if you're looking to cover miles, that's an excellent choice because they roll rather well, but for an all-mountain bike, I don't think a Receptive at the front is the ideal choice, really. So when I was riding it in the Alps on the launch of this bike, the front end just wasn't as confident as I'd really like. It would really be good to see something like a mini DHF as standard. So during my test period, we brought it home, and it's the UK, it's all wet and horrible and sloppy. So I put on some super aggressive tyres just to put up with that. So up front I've got a shorty and there's an Assegai at the rear. It doesn't really matter, but it's just meant that this bike could suit the kind of riding I'm doing a little bit better. Something that this bike doesn't have that will come on the stock or consumer bikes is a pair of tyre whizzers. So moving on still, and we'll talk about the bike's geometry, and here Scott's spot on. They say it's pretty progressive, but generally it's just an all-mountain bike. It's what we've come to used to and what's becoming almost a standard. So this is a large frame. It gets a 485mm reach, which is lovely. So moving on to the head angle, and it's actually really cool. So rather than putting a flip chip into the bike, that would change a lot of the geometry. Instead, it gets headset cups that you can turn. So I've got it in the slackest setting at the moment, which is 63.9 degrees for the head angle, and that's not too bad at all. But if you want to steepen it up a bit, you can steepen it by a full degree just by loosening up the headset a little bit, turning those cups. So if you're doing a day's climbing, that's super useful, and you still get a reasonably confident head angle when you're going on the downs. And I forget what the seat tube angle is, but it's rather steep. It's not too bad for a bike of this kind. It places right away reasonably centrally over the bike, and it's just generally comfortable to pedal for a long period of time. And that's only helped by this twin lock mechanism. So at first it's something that I kind of dismissed, something that's kind of destined for the bin. And that was an absolute preconceived conception. Because actually I've used it at any opportunity I can. As it stands, this bike is beautifully efficient. So that's fully open, the rear end hardly moves at all, and it's really receptive to any pedal inputs. But if you lock out the suspension, it boosts efficiency further. So this has made me like PB some climbs, and it's meant that I've been able to put even more aggressive tyres on than I'd usually like without facing the penalty of all that drag. But that doesn't mean that everything was absolutely gold with twin lock. You know, there are 3 remotes on one side, and that is quite a lot for anybody to get their heads around. But at first I was fumbling. I'll try to lock out the suspension on a quick downhill to uphill transition, and the dropper post will come up or something like that instead. But after a little bit of time, it's something that I really gotten used to. The paddles do feel very different. Of course, the dropper post one is closer to your hand, and then the open up one, or the open lever, is really small. So it's really easy just to figure out which one's which, and you can just do it on the fly really simply. So the benefits that twin lock offers really outweighs the time learning it. And when you tip this bike downhill, the genius is all about its absolute featherweight and that heft of stiffness. Cornering this bike feels like you're cornering one piece, and it's a characteristic that can only be found on hardtails, really. It offers a racy and precise characteristic that's great at holding its line when you're going through some really rattly rock gardens. Though granted, this might not be a characteristic that everybody would appreciate, because sometimes a lot of lateral stiffness reduces overall grip. And there can be too much of a good thing, because even though Syncross has slimmed down this bar and made it a little bit more compliant, it's still incredibly stiff. So even on relatively short descents, I felt arm pump come in really soon. If this were my bike, I would change that bar pretty quickly. So it goes without saying, but Scott has completely overhauled the suspension kinematic of this bike. You know, it looks completely different. But what the brand has done is made it super progressive and super adaptable. So I've been able to run this bike at 35% sag without any harsh bottom mats or any real negativity. And it still pedals really well, but it boosts small bump sensitivity, so it feels like an absolute downhill bike when run at this setting. But most of the time I've run it around 25 to 30% sag just to increase the efficiency a little bit and give me a little bit more trail feedback. And even then, small bump sensitivity is still rather good. While there is quite a bit of small bump sensitivity that soaks up all of the harsh and horrible bumps on the trail, there's a lot of mid-stroke support as soon as you push past that sag point. So while it feels like a downhill bike sometimes, if you just push past that point, it becomes mega playful and you'll be popping off roots and trees and all that kind of stuff. And that's only aided by the bike's feather weight. As the light weight means that this bike, as you're riding, is really easy just to pick up and swap lines. As a long-legged trail bike, this is a rather playful bit of kit. And then thanks to that suspension's progression, and similarly to the climbs, it's super receptive to any pedal inputs. So if you hang up on a tight corner or something, just stick a couple of pedal strokes in and it fires you right back out. But the integrated concept on this bike does pose a little bit of a problem, and that comes in the form of shock warm-up or heat retention. As the shock moves lots, it creates heat, and there's absolutely no ventilation here. So it can hold on to that heat for a little bit longer, and it can get a little bit warmer over especially longer descents. When we were riding in the Alps, it was about 30 degrees out and you definitely feel a little bit of damping fade away. But this is something that I've also noticed doing longer descents in the UK. However, it's nowhere near as bad and I doubt it will become an issue. If this is something that concerns you, Scott has the Supertune model, which is a more gravity-orientated bike, and it gets a piggyback on that shock, so it should deal with heat a lot better. Touched on before, the Genius's geometry is spot on for its intention. It's confident in steeps and reasonably stable without being so long that it's an absolute boat in the corners. Again, the lightweight helps here as it adds a chunk of agility. The head angle's slackest setting does add even more confidence on those downhills, but it can wander when you climb. And that's where this headset really helps, because you can just switch those cups around and pull that front wheel in a little bit. And that gives you much more support when you're climbing. It also makes the steering a bit more direct. So let's move on to the rather touchy subject of this bike's value. And £12,000 is an incredible amount of money to spend on a mountain bike. I mean, for that kind of money, you can get the base model Scott Genius and go on a pretty good riding holiday. Or if you're into cars, you can get a second-hand Lotus Evoque. But what you're spending your money on here is that high-end carbon frame and all of the R&D that's gone into this bike to make it what it is. And of course, there is also that mental high-end build kit and all of that carbon. You know, it's an expensive bike, but you do get what you pay for here. But that's not to say that there's tons of bikes that are cheaper that will perform similarly. You know, I can't say that any of them will be quite as stiff as this or as light, but you know, we can talk about the Specialized S-Works bikes, so the Stump Jumper and the Enduro. Neither of them come within £2,000 of this bike, and those are very expensive bikes as it is. And of course, this bike is absolutely stunning. You know, when I've been riding around, it's turned tons and tons of heads, but if you look even closer, the paint job is absolutely beautiful. So the front end sparkles, and as you go to the rear end, it's kind of it is a raw carbon with a bit of a coating on top. It's just a stunning bit of kit. So that is the full review of the Scott Genius 900 Ultimate. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.